Medieval times were harsh, with constant dangers from war, disease, and famine. Survival was tough, and without modern comforts, it's clear why thriving for even a day would be nearly impossible. Gareth sat by the hearth, watching the flames flicker and crackle as the simmering pottage bubbled in the pot. His hands, calloused from years of hard labour, rested on his knees, feeling the heat from the fire against his skin. The smell of the dish, a mixture of stale vegetables and salty broth, filled the small cottage, overpowering everything else. He was used to it by now. In fact, it had become part of the rhythm of his life, the endless stirring, the constant adding of ingredients day after day, week after week. The pottage had been simmering since early morning, and now, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, it was almost time for supper. His mother, Elsa, was busy chopping up a few old carrots and a wilted cabbage she'd salvaged from the garden earlier that morning. She dropped them into the pot with a weary sigh. "Another week, another batch," Elsa muttered, her voice hoarse from years of hard work and little sleep. She stirred the pot with a wooden spoon, her motions automatic, like those of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. Gareth nodded, though he didn't have the energy to reply. What was there to say? The pottage was their life. It was their food, their fuel, their daily sustenance. It was the same thick, watery soup that had kept their bellies full for as long as he could remember. The pottage was always different, and yet it was always the same. A few scraps of leftover meat, stale bread, some root vegetables, all thrown together and boiled for hours until the flavours melded into a mushy, lifeless mass. He glanced over at the pot and frowned. The surface of the pottage was greasy, a thin film of fat floating atop the broth. It was hard to tell if it was from the previous week's stew or from the rancid bits of salted pork they had added last night. Whatever it was, it made Gareth's stomach churn. But there was no choice. It was either this or go hungry. His younger brother, Edric, entered the room, his hands still covered in dirt from working the fields. He sniffed the air and wrinkled his nose, a look of mild disgust crossing his face. "Pottage again?" Edric asked, his voice filled with a mix of resignation and frustration. "What else?" Elsa replied, not bothering to look up from her task. "We can't eat what we don't have, boy." Edric sat down at the small wooden table, scraping the dirt off his boots. He sighed deeply, his eyes drifting to the pot. Gareth knew exactly how his brother felt. The food was always the same, bland, lifeless, and at times barely edible. They had eaten pottage for as long as Gareth could remember, and while his mother and father had once told him that food was meant to nourish the body, he wasn't so sure anymore. The pottage was thick, the consistency of paste, and it always tasted the same, salty, sour, and occasionally, if they were lucky, a bit of meat would add a slight flavour to the otherwise miserable dish. "Will it ever end?" Edric muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. The question lingered in the air. Would it ever end? Would they ever be able to eat something other than pottage? Something that didn't leave their stomachs grumbling in protest long after the meal was finished? Gareth didn't answer. He wasn't sure what to say. The truth was, he didn't think it would end. This was the way life was. They were peasants, living off the land, scraping by with what little they had. They could not afford to be picky about food. There was always something in the pot, and that was enough. Most of the time, that was enough. But sometimes, when the pottage was particularly bad, when the stale cheese they kept in the corner was more mould than edible food, Gareth allowed himself to dream of a time when things would be different, when food would taste good, when their meals wouldn't be a daily reminder of their poverty and hardship. It was a foolish dream, he knew. But still, the thought crossed his mind from time to time. Elsa finally stopped stirring and lifted the pot off the fire. She ladled out portions into bowls, the liquid thick and greasy, the vegetables soft and mushy. Gareth accepted his bowl with a nod, careful not to touch his mother's hand as she served him. It was not that he didn't love her. It was just that food had become such a grim business that any unnecessary touching during meals felt like a breach of some unspoken rule. Edric picked at his bowl, poking at the floating bits of carrot and onion. Gareth watched him for a moment before turning his attention back to his own portion. The pottage was steaming, but it wasn't hot enough to burn his mouth. He scooped a spoonful into his mouth and chewed slowly, the texture of the mush unpleasant. Against his tongue. "You think we'll get anything different this week?" Edric asked after a moment, his voice sounding almost hopeful. Gareth shook his head. "If we're lucky, we'll get a bit of salted fish, maybe some cheese." "Maybe," Edric repeated, and they both fell silent. The rest of the evening passed, in quiet resignation. The only sound was the scraping of spoons against bowls and the crackling of the fire. Outside, the wind howled, but inside the cottage, it was warm enough that Gareth could almost forget about the cold stone walls and the hardships that lay beyond their door. He thought about how life could have been different. How, in a different time or place, they might have eaten hearty meals, with bread that was soft and fresh, and cheese that didn't reek of old curdled milk. But for now, there was only pottage, and there always would be. Lena wiped her hands on her apron, glancing nervously at the small crowd of villagers gathered around her stall. The midday sun beat down on the dusty marketplace, and the air was thick with the smells of sweat, earth, and food. Her stall crammed. Between two larger vendors was a humble sight. Wooden shelves filled with various cheeses, salted fish, and a few hunks of dry, hard bread. She had spent the morning slicing and wrapping her wares, and now, as always, she hoped for a good day of sales. The cheese she sold was hardly the best in the region. Most of it came from the aging wheel of curd her family produced, left to ripen in the damp cellars beneath their home. The scent was sharp, sometimes sour, and it clung to the air like a heavy mist. Yet, for the villagers, it was a delicacy, of sorts, an essential part of their meagre diet. Lena couldn't blame them for buying it, though. What else did they have? Fresh vegetables, meat, and fruits were luxuries beyond reach. The wealthier folk ate well, of course, but for peasants like her family, cheese and salted fish were the only sources of nutrition, and, if they were fortunate, a small indulgence. How much for the cheese? A middle-aged woman, her face lined, with years of sun and toil, leaned forward, eyeing the wedge of cheese Lena had just cut. Lena hesitated, her fingers twitching nervously as she placed the wedge onto the scale. She knew the woman couldn't afford much, but she also knew that the economy in their village was tight. People's pockets were always empty, and the barter system was their only lifeline. 2 copper for that piece, Lena said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. The woman frowned but handed over the coins. "The cheese smells old," she muttered under her breath, wrapping it quickly in cloth before shuffling away. Lena sighed. She had heard those words before. It seemed that the cheese, no matter how much she tried to improve it, always had the same pungent, unpleasant odour. She'd even tried adding herbs to the curd in a desperate attempt to make it more appealing. But nothing seemed to work. And yet the villagers ate it. The stench, the texture, it didn't matter. Cheese was food. And that was all that mattered in this grim world. Lena cast a glance across the market. There were other stalls selling bread, dried meat, and herbs. But none of them had what she truly longed for. Fresh food. Something that didn't smell like decay or rot. She watched as a group of children ran past, their eyes wide as they gazed at a vendor selling fresh berries. It was the kind of sight that made her stomach twist in envy. The thought of fresh, crisp bread, juicy fruits, or a warm, hearty stew was enough to make Lena's mouth water. She often dreamed of such luxuries, of a time when food was not just a means of survival, but a pleasure. But in their world, those things were out of reach, relegated to stories of the rich. For people like Lena, food was just another task, a necessary evil to fill the belly and endure the day. She glanced toward the horizon, her thoughts momentarily drifting away from the marketplace. The world beyond the village felt distant, like a dream. It was hard to imagine that there could be places where food was fresh, where life wasn't a constant struggle for survival. It was even harder to imagine that a simple meal could be enjoyed for its own sake, without fear of illness, spoilage, or hunger. Her thoughts were interrupted by a familiar voice. "Lena, you're still here." She turned to find Gareth, his hand resting on the wooden post that held up her stall. His shirt was worn and stained with dirt, but his face was kind, his eyes warm. Though they were both from the same village, Gareth always seemed different, more thoughtful, more curious about the world than most others. He had a way of seeing things that made Lena wonder what life could be like if they weren't bound by the harsh realities of their existence. "Gareth," she said, offering him a faint smile. "Just finished selling the last of it." He glanced down at the cheese with a look of mild distaste, but said nothing. "I saw you from across the market. How's the cheese business?" "Same as always," Lena replied with a shrug. "People buy it because they have no choice, I suppose. I'd like to sell something that doesn't smell like death, but that's not really an option." Her voice was laced with frustration, though she tried to hide it. She was tired of this routine, the endless cycle of selling food that no one really enjoyed. Gareth nodded, his expression sympathetic. "I wish I could help you, Lena. You deserve better than this." She met his eyes, her heart fluttering for a brief moment. Gareth always spoke with such sincerity, such kindness. There was something in his gaze that made her feel like there was a world outside of pottage and cheese, a world that didn't involve constant sacrifice and struggle. "I dream of better things, Gareth," she confessed softly, more to herself than to him. "I dream of food that doesn't make my stomach turn. Fresh bread, a nice stew, maybe even fruit that's sweet, not bitter. I don't know if I'll ever get there, though." Gareth took a step closer, lowering his voice so no one could overhear. "There's a world beyond the village, you know. A place where people don't live like this. I've heard travelers speak of it. Food that's actually enjoyable. I don't know how it's possible, but I've heard the stories." Lena's heart quickened. "What do you mean?" she asked, leaning in, her voice barely a whisper. "Merchants and traders come through sometimes. They've got fresh fruits and meats. They speak of spices, cheeses that aren't so, well, pungent." He paused for a moment, then smiled. "There's a place where food isn't just a necessity. It's something to be enjoyed." Lena stared at him, wide-eyed. The possibility of a better life, of better food, seemed so far away, so impossible. But Gareth's words filled her with something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. "Maybe someday," she whispered, a soft smile tugging at her lips. Gareth nodded, his eyes filled with quiet understanding. Maybe someday. As the day wore on, Lena continued selling her cheese, but her mind wandered far beyond the small stall. She began to imagine what it would be like to taste fresh fruit, warm bread, or even a dish that didn't carry the weight of decay with every bite. She dreamed of a time when food would no longer be a burden, but a joy. It seemed so distant, but for the first time, it didn't feel impossible. It had been a few days since Lena and Gareth's conversation about the possibility of a world beyond the pottage and cheese, and yet the villagers still seemed trapped in their routine, their diets as dull and bleak as ever. The smell of aging, cheese and salted fish lingered in the air, a constant reminder of the reality they lived in. It was a world where food was a necessity, not a pleasure, and health was often an afterthought. As the days passed, Lena began to notice something unsettling. A few of the villagers who had come to her stall for cheese over the past week had started showing signs of sickness. At first, it was subtle, a cough here, a slight fever there. But soon, the symptoms began to spread. People began complaining of stomach cramps, nausea, and dizziness. Some even started vomiting after meals. Lena was concerned, but she didn't know what to make of it. After all, the food they ate, though unpleasant, had always been their sustenance. It wasn't like anyone had complained about it before. The villagers were used to their stale bread, their pungent cheese, their salted fish. It was just how things were. But now, something felt different. Something was wrong. One evening, as Lena was packing up her stall, she saw Oswald, the elderly man who lived down the street from her family's cottage, stumbling toward her. His usually steady steps were uneven, his face pale. He clutched his stomach as he approached, a grimace twisting his features. "Lena," he gasped, his voice hoarse. "I don't feel right." She quickly moved to his side, concern flooding her chest. "Oswald, what's wrong? You look pale." "It's my belly," he muttered, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. "I ate too much of that rotten fish. It's been weeks since we had anything fresh, and I don't know how much longer I can take it. Everything's been making me sick." Lena's heart sank. Oswald had always been a tough old man, used to the hardships of village life. If he was feeling this bad, something was terribly wrong. "Have you seen the healer?" Lena asked, her voice tight with worry. Oswald shook his head, his eyes dull. "Matilda doesn't know what to do. She says it's just the winter chill, that it'll pass, but it's getting worse. I feel weak." Lena took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. She knew that food had been the main culprit for years. The salted fish, the old cheese, the pottage, it was all they had, but it was taking its toll. Maybe they had all been too blind to see it before. Maybe we need to stop eating the same things every day, Lena suggested. We can try something different. There are merchants who pass through sometimes. Perhaps there's something out there, something fresh. I don't know. But we can't keep going like this. Oswald's eyes narrowed, and he shook his head, as if the suggestion was too radical. Fresh food. Fresh food isn't for people like us, Lena. We have to make do. It's what we've always done. His words stung, but Lena didn't give up. "Oswald, something's wrong. People are getting sick. The food, it's not right." But Oswald wasn't listening. He turned away from her, muttering under his breath as he shuffled down the street. Lena stood there, watching him go, her heart heavy with the weight of the truth she had just uncovered. The food had become a poison, slowly killing them, and yet no one was willing to acknowledge it. That night, after a long day of selling cheese and worrying about Oswald's condition, Lena found herself sitting by the fire in her family's cottage, staring at the pottage that was simmering on the hearth. Her mother, Elsa, was busy adding more scraps to the pot, just like they did every week. "Mum, do you think it's the food?" Lena asked quietly, her voice almost trembling. "Do you think it's what's making people sick?" Elsa didn't look up from her work. She had long since stopped questioning their food. "Food's food, Lena. It's all we have. No one's ever complained before. We're alive, aren't we?" Lena's frustration bubbled to the surface. "But we're not really alive, are we? Not in the way we should be. We eat this mess every day. The same old cheese, the same salted fish, the same rotten vegetables. And now people are getting sick, and no one will listen." Elsa paused, her hands stilling for a moment as she turned to face her daughter. Her eyes were tired, and her face was etched with years of struggle. "Lena, we don't have a choice. You know that." Lena's throat tightened as she glanced down at the pot. The thick, greasy liquid bubbled and popped as if mocking her. She felt trapped, suffocated by the food that was supposed to nourish them. It was supposed to keep them alive, but it was doing the opposite. It was draining the life out of them, bit by bit, year after year. "Maybe there is a choice," Lena whispered, mostly to herself. "Maybe we could find a way to change things." Elsa gave her a soft, knowing smile, though there was no hope in it. Maybe. But no one's ever tried. They just live with it. Lena clenched her fists, a fire igniting within her. She wasn't sure how or when, but she knew one thing for certain. Something had to change. The food, the way they had always lived. It wasn't enough anymore. She couldn't watch her people suffer from their own ignorance. That night, after Elsa and her brother had gone to bed, Lena lay awake in the dark, her mind racing with thoughts of escape, of finding a better way. She thought of the merchants, the travellers Gareth had spoken of. Perhaps there was a world beyond their village, a world where food wasn't a death sentence. She didn't know how, but she would find a way. She had to, for herself, for the villagers, for Oswald. And with that thought, a new sense of determination washed over her, the first real hope she had felt in years. The road outside the village was long and dusty, but to Lena, it was the road to freedom. For days, she had stewed over the idea of leaving. Every time she looked at the pottage simmering on the hearth, or saw the villagers eating their rancid cheese and salted fish, she was reminded of the stifling, unhealthy life that held them in its grip. The vision of a better life had taken root in her mind, and now she couldn't shake the idea of escaping, if only for a short time, to see if there really something was better out there. It was early in the morning when she finally made up her mind. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a pale light over the fields as Lena packed a small bundle. She slipped out of her cottage quietly, careful not to wake her mother or brother, who would only try to talk her out of it. The only person who would understand was Gareth. She found him near the edge of the village, leaning against a wooden fence, staring out at the distant hills. His shirt was worn, as usual, but his eyes sparkled with something that resembled excitement. When he saw Lena, a faint smile tugged at his lips. "Lena," he greeted, his voice full of warmth. "You're up early. What's going on?" "I'm leaving," she said simply. "I have to see for myself, Gareth. I need to know if there's more than this. More than pottage, more than cheese, more than the life we've been living." Gareth's eyebrows shot up in surprise, and then he nodded, as if he had been expecting this moment. "I understand. I've been thinking the same thing. There's got to be more to life than this." Lena hesitated, her heart racing at the thought of what she was about to do. "I don't know how long I'll be gone, but I need you to come with me." Gareth didn't need any further encouragement. Without a word, he stood and slung a satchel over his shoulder. Together, they set off down the road, the sound of their footsteps mingling with the chirping of birds, in the early morning light. As they walked, Lena couldn't help but feel both anxious and hopeful. The world outside the village was unknown, but for the first time in her life, the idea of something better didn't seem impossible. She had heard rumours of merchants travelling between villages, selling fresh produce, spices, meats, and even fruits, things that she had only ever dreamed about. Could it be real? Could they really find a place where food didn't rot before you could eat it, where people didn't suffer from poor nutrition and sickness? For hours, they walked in silence, the village slowly fading behind them. The farther they went, the more the landscape changed, from rough, barren fields to patches of forest and rolling hills. Lena's feet were sore, and the heat of the sun was beginning to weigh on her, but the excitement of the unknown pushed her forward. By midday, they reached a small town. It was far larger than their village, with bustling streets and merchants, peddling goods. Lena's heart skipped a beat as she looked around at the variety of food being sold. Fresh bread, fruit and vegetables were piled high in baskets, their colours vibrant and appealing. The scent of roasting meat and fragrant spices filled the air. For the first time in years, Lena felt her stomach growl, not out of hunger, but out of longing. This is what I've been dreaming of," Lena whispered to Gareth, her eyes wide with wonder. Gareth looked around, a look of amazement on his face. "I didn't know this place existed. It's like another world." They wandered through the market, mesmerized by the unfamiliar sights and smells. They stopped at a stall filled with fresh bread, the warm, yeasty scent enveloping them. "How much for a loaf?" Lena asked the baker, her voice almost reverent. The man behind the counter smiled and handed her a small loaf. 2 copper, he said, holding out his hand. Lena hesitated for a moment before reaching into her pouch. She only had a few coppers left, but this was worth it. She handed him the money, and as he passed her the bread, she felt a sense of triumph. It was warm and soft, a stark contrast to the hard, stale bread back home. Lena broke off a piece of the bread and handed it to Gareth. The two of them bit into it, savouring the taste. It was soft, fluffy, and rich with flavour. She hadn't tasted anything like it before, and for a moment, she closed her eyes, letting the sensation of something truly fresh wash over her. "This is what food should be," she said quietly, her voice full of wonder. Gareth nodded, his mouth full. "I never thought I'd taste something like this. It's alive. The bread back home, well, it's barely edible compared to this." As they continued their exploration of the town, they came across a merchant selling colourful fruits. Lena couldn't resist. She picked up an apple, its skin bright red and shiny. She handed over a copper coin and took a bite. The sweetness exploded in her mouth. She had never tasted anything like it before. Crisp, juicy, and bursting with flavour, the fruit felt like a revelation. A moment of clarity amidst the fog of their miserable meals back home. She took another bite, then handed it to Gareth. "This is incredible," he murmured, taking a tentative bite. "I never realised how much I've been missing." They spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the town, sampling fresh food at every corner. But as the sun began to set, they knew it was time to return to their village. They had seen the possibilities of a better life, a life that didn't revolve around survival, but enjoyment. As they walked back down the road, the weight of what they had experienced hung heavy on their hearts. They had tasted what could be, but they also knew the truth. Most of the villagers would never have access to these luxuries. The path to change, to a better life, wasn't easy, but Lena was determined. The world outside the village was full of possibility, and she was not going to let it slip away. They were not going to let it slip away, not now, not ever. The journey back to the village was filled with heavy silence, each step they took seeming to echo the weight of what they had seen, what they had tasted. Lena and Gareth walked side by side, the warmth of the bread and fruit still lingering on their tongues, while the familiar scent of their village grew nearer, dragging them back into the reality they had just left behind. The world beyond the village had opened up to them, and though they longed to stay in that realm of possibility, they knew they had to return. They had a responsibility to the people they had left behind. As they reached the outskirts of the village, the familiar sights greeted them: cracked cobblestones, low stone cottages, and the ever-present aroma of stale pottage and rotting cheese. The stark contrast between the town they had just visited and the village they called home was more apparent than ever. It was as though they had crossed into two entirely different worlds, each with its own rules, its own way of life. Lena's heart sank. She had seen the possibility of change, but now, faced with the familiar sights of the village, doubt crept in. Could they really make a difference? Was it even possible to convince the villagers that they deserved more than what they had? Or would the weight of tradition keep them shackled to their ways? "I don't know how to even begin," Lena said quietly, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "The people here, they're so set in their ways. They don't know anything else. They won't understand what we've seen." Gareth, walking beside her, seemed to have no such doubts. "We can show them, Lena. We've seen the world outside. These walls. We know what food can be like. It's not just about surviving anymore. It's about living. People deserve more than pottage, more than cheese that stinks. They deserve a life where food isn't a punishment." Lena met his gaze, and for the first time since they had left the village, a spark of hope flickered within her. Gareth's words were simple, but true. They had to try, no matter how hard it would be. Change wouldn't come easily, but it wouldn't come at all if they didn't make the effort. As they made their way through the village, the familiar faces of the villagers seemed to watch them with curiosity. They had been gone for only a few days, but it felt as though they had been away for years. The world they had encountered in the town beyond the hills was so different from this place. It almost felt unreal. But as they passed the homes of their neighbours, it became clear to Lena that the only way to move forward was to face what lay behind them. They stopped at the market, where Lena's stall still stood, her meagre stock of cheese and salted fish displayed under the dusty awning. She glanced at it, and for a moment she felt sick to her stomach. Was this all they were ever going to have? Was this all anyone in the village would ever have? Gareth stepped up beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. We can't change everything overnight, Lena, but we can start small. We can begin by showing them there's something else. Lena nodded, though the fear of failure lingered in her chest. She had never been one to challenge tradition. Her family, like everyone else in the village, had always done things the way they had been done for generations. Food had always been about survival, about getting by. There had never been any thought given to whether it was good, whether it brought joy, whether it nourished the soul. She looked around at the village, at the people who bustled about their daily routines, unaware of the possibilities beyond their small world. She knew that change wouldn't be easy, and there was no guarantee that they would succeed. But Gareth was right. If they didn't try, nothing would ever change. That evening, they gathered a small group of villagers in the central square. Lena had told them that she wanted to share something with them, something they had never seen before. Gareth stood by her side, his presence reassuring. As the villagers gathered, their faces wary but curious, Lena felt a wave of anxiety flood over her. "Thank you for coming," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I know that things haven't been easy here. Food has always been a struggle for us, but Gareth and we've seen something different, and we think it's time for change. We deserve better than this." There was a murmur of disbelief from the crowd. People exchanged confused glances, some shaking their heads, others frowning. Better than this. Old Milda, a woman who had lived in the village longer than anyone, spoke up, her voice rough with age. "What do you mean, girl? The pottage keeps us alive. The cheese fills our bellies. What's wrong with that?" Lena took a deep breath. "I've tasted food that isn't just about survival. I've eaten bread that's warm and soft, fruits that taste sweet, cheese that doesn't stink. There's a world outside of our village. People live in a way that doesn't make food a burden. It's something to enjoy." The villagers remained silent, their faces unreadable. The skepticism in their eyes was palpable. Lena could see the doubt, the fear of the unknown. They were afraid of change, afraid of losing what little stability they had. Gareth stepped forward, his voice firm. "I know it's hard to believe. We've lived like this for so long. It feels like the only way. But I'm telling you, there's more out there. People don't have to live with sickness and rot in their food. We can eat well. We can live well." The silence that followed was thick. The villagers exchanged uncertain glances, the weight of the conversation pressing down on them. Finally, Oswald, the elderly man who had been the first to speak of his illness, spoke up, his voice hoarse but determined. "I've been sick for weeks," he said quietly, "and I've seen others fall ill too. Maybe it's time to listen. Maybe we need to change." A ripple of agreement spread through the crowd, though it was tentative, fragile. The seeds of doubt had been planted, but whether they would grow or wither was still uncertain. Lena's heart raced as she watched the villagers process her words. She knew it wouldn't be easy. They would resist, they would doubt, and many would fight against the idea of leaving behind the traditions that had defined their lives for generations. But at that moment, as she looked out at the faces of her neighbours, something shifted within her. She had made them think, even if just for a moment. "Change won't happen all at once," Lena said softly. "But it has to start somewhere. We can make small steps together. We don't have to keep living like this." And though the road ahead seemed uncertain, Lena felt a sense of peace, knowing that she had started something. It wouldn't be easy, but she wasn't alone. And for the first time in her life, the idea of a better world, one where food wasn't just about survival, seemed within reach. The room was dim, the only light coming from the flickering fire in the hearth. Shadows stretched long against the rough stone walls of the peasant cottage. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and dried herbs, mingling with the faint smell of animal fur. In the corner, a goat snorted in its sleep, its hooves tapping softly on the wooden floorboards. Beside it, a cat lazily groomed its fur, paying no mind to the unrest of the humans in the room. Leona lay awake on her straw mattress, her body stiff with exhaustion. It wasn't yet time for her to sleep, but the weight of the long day pressed down on her, making it difficult to stay alert. She was the night shift sleeper, the one who stayed awake while the rest of her family rested. Her eyes flitted nervously toward the small wooden door, half expecting it to burst open with the unknown, whether it be a thief, an animal, or worse, a plague-ridden traveller. The sleeping sickness, as the villagers called it, had begun to spread across the land. People spoke of it in hushed whispers, their eyes wide with fear. It came swiftly, stealing away one's life before the morning sun had risen. Some said it was the curse of the gods, others blamed it on bad air, but most believed it to be a consequence of the old ways. The ways of sleeping in shifts, always, keeping one eye open, never allowing the body to fully rest. Leona's mother, Maeve, had done her best to keep the family safe. She had carefully placed bundles of dried lavender, thyme, and rosemary beneath their mattresses, certain that these herbs would ward off the disease. The smell of it filled the room, mingling with the sour scent of the straw. Leona had been told over and over that the herbs were a shield, but each night, as she lay awake, she couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't enough. What if it wasn't the sickness that got them, but something else? Her younger brother, Rowan, slept fitfully beside her, his breathing shallow. He had inherited their father's restless nature, always twitching in his sleep, as though running from some unseen danger. Leona's eyes flickered to the window where the moon cast a pale light onto the dirt floor. "Are you still awake, Leona?" Her mother's whisper broke the silence, making Leona jump. Maeve was lying on the far side of the room, tucked under a woolen blanket, her breath steady with sleep. "Yes, Mother," Leona replied softly, not wanting to wake the others. "I'm keeping watch." Her mother's eyes glimmered in the firelight, her face drawn and tired from a lifetime of toil. "You must get some rest too, my girl. The night is long, and we need you well." Leona's heart ached for her mother. They both knew that it was not just the night shift that wore her down, but the constant fear that something dreadful would find its way into their home. No one was safe in these uncertain times. The nobles slept soundly in their feather beds, shielded from the dangers of the common folk, but the peasants had no such luxuries. A simple straw mattress, a few herbs for protection, and the ever-present threat of the sickness. This was the reality of their lives. Leona shifted uncomfortably, pulling her thin woolen blanket tighter around her shoulders. Her body ached from the poor rest she had gotten the night before. It had been her sister's turn to sleep in shifts, and Leona had kept her eyes open, watching for danger, while her sister Maris slept peacefully, unaware of the creeping dread that clung to the air. It was always like this. Someone had to be awake, always on edge, while the others tried to find some semblance of rest. The ticking of the clock on the mantel reminded Leona of the passing time. The village bell would ring soon, signalling the hour when the first shift of sleep would end and the next one would begin. She glanced at the window again, her thoughts wandering. The stars shone bright and cold in the night sky, as if mocking her inability to truly rest. It was the same each night, never fully asleep, always aware of the dangers lurking in the dark. "Leona," her mother's voice broke her thoughts. "Do you still believe in the herbs, that they will keep us safe?" Leona hesitated, then nodded, though the doubt lingered in her heart. She didn't want to believe that their best efforts might not be enough. But deep down, she feared the sickness might find them, regardless of the herbs. "I hope so," she whispered, though her voice lacked conviction. Maeve sighed softly, her breath steady, but there was a quiet sadness in her eyes. Hope is a precious thing, child. But don't let it blind you to the truth. Rest when you can. Sleep is a luxury that we cannot afford. Leona stared at the shadows on the wall, the sound of her family's breathing soothing her for a brief moment. She closed her eyes, trying to find some peace in the dark room, though she knew it would never come. The night was long, and the danger always lurked just beyond the edges of her awareness. Lord Alistair stretched out on his plush feather mattress, the silken sheets cool against his skin. His bedroom was a far cry from the cold, cramped cottages of the peasants. The walls were adorned with tapestries depicting great battles, and a fire roared in the hearth, its warmth enveloping the room. A large four-poster bed, draped in deep red velvet, sat in the centre of the space. The scent of incense mixed with the rich wood of the furniture, a stark contrast to the pungent smells of the peasants' cottages. He should have been at ease, should have found comfort in his opulence. But instead, there was an unsettling restlessness in his chest. The constant worry of the sleeping sickness gnawed at him, just as it did the common folk. Though his family was shielded by wealth and influence, no one was truly safe from the mysterious illness that seemed to sweep through the land with increasing frequency. Lord Alistair turned over, glancing at his wife, Lady Elira, who slept soundly beside him, her golden hair spread across the pillow, her breathing steady and calm. She seemed untouched by the horrors that plagued the peasants, her life one of comfort and ease. But Alistair knew better than to think that luxury could protect anyone from the unseen dangers lurking in the world. The nobles had their own method of dealing with the sickness, elaborate rituals, expensive tonics, and nightly prayers to the gods. But even as Alistair lay in his warm, soft bed, he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't enough. There was something about the way the sickness spread, silently and swiftly, that made him feel vulnerable in a way he had never felt before. The nobles could protect themselves with wealth, but they couldn't protect their souls from fear. He turned his head and gazed out of the large window, where the moon hung high in the sky. The night was still, and the distant sounds of the village were barely audible. The rustling of the trees, the soft murmur of the wind, these were the only noises that reached his ears. It was a peaceful night, but even that tranquility felt fleeting. Alistair had heard rumours that the sickness wasn't just affecting the poor anymore. There had been whispers of nobles succumbing to it, their once healthy bodies withering away before their servants could even call for help. Even within the walls of his castle, Alistair felt the creeping uncertainty. He had become obsessed with the idea that he too might fall victim to the sickness. He had tried to shut it out, tried to bury it beneath layers of wealth and status, but it clawed at him in the quiet of the night when there was no one to see. He glanced at the small vial of lavender oil on his nightstand. He had been advised to use it, just as the peasants used their herbs. But the scent did little to calm his nerves. It only served as a reminder of how fragile life was, how easily everything could slip away. At that moment, he heard a faint sound, a rustling, a creak of wood. Something, or someone, was moving in the shadows. His heart skipped a beat, and his hand instinctively reached for the dagger he kept hidden beneath his pillow. The sounds grew louder, closer. His eyes narrowed in the darkness, trying to make sense of what he was hearing. But before he could react, a voice broke through the silence. Alistair, Lady Elira's voice was soft, but it carried the weight of someone who had just awoken from a restless sleep. "What's wrong?" He sat up slowly, his heart still racing. "I thought I heard something," he murmured, forcing his hand to release the grip on the dagger. Elira sat up beside him, her eyes filled with concern. "It's just the wind, my love. You need to rest. The sickness isn't near us." Her hand reached out to him, her touch gentle and warm. But Alistair knew better. "You don't understand. It's not just the sickness. It's everything. It's the fear that we're all living in. The fear that no matter how much we have, it won't be enough to protect us." Elira's eyes softened. She didn't share his worries. She had grown up in the safety of the castle, where the only concerns were lavish feasts and social gatherings. But Alistair had seen the rumours, the half-filled graves of nobles who had been struck down by the sickness. He had seen the way the common folk looked at him, as though expecting him to somehow have the answer. "We are safe, Alistair," Alira said, her voice firm. "We are blessed, and with the gods on our side, nothing can harm us." Her words, though comforting, did little to ease his mind. He nodded, trying to push the unease away, but it lingered, a shadow in the back of his mind. He turned back to the window, his eyes scanning the darkness once more. The village below was silent, as though holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. He knew the night would end, just as it always did. The sun would rise, and with it would come another day of uncertainty. But for now, the night stretched on, and Alistair lay awake, surrounded by wealth and luxury, yet feeling more secure than the peasants who slept in the cold, their fears just as real as his own. The fire had burned low, casting only faint glimmers of light across the room. Leona sat on her straw mattress, her back pressed against the cold stone wall, her eyes strained in the dimness, her every sense heightened as she listened to the sounds of the night. Rowan's soft breathing was the only comforting noise in the room, the faint rustling of the goat from the corner, and the occasional creak of wood as the house settled. The familiar noises that usually brought her comfort now only added to the tension. Tonight felt different. The usual quiet of the cottage had been replaced by a thick, almost oppressive silence. The wind had died down, and the sounds of the village seemed distant, as though muffled by an unseen force. It was as though the night itself held its breath, waiting for something to happen. Leona's fingers nervously traced the edges of the herb bundle beneath her pillow. Her mother had made sure. They all had their protection, but it didn't seem enough tonight. Her instincts were on high alert, her heart racing for reasons she couldn't quite explain. It had been weeks since the sleeping sickness had been rumoured to reach the village. The sickness that took its victims in the dead of night, when their bodies were at their most vulnerable, never giving them a chance to fight back. And yet no one truly knew what caused it. Was it the air, the herbs, or perhaps something more sinister? Leona couldn't shake the feeling that the sickness wasn't the only danger lurking in the dark. From somewhere outside, a door creaked open, a loud, deliberate sound that made her pulse quicken. Her eyes flicked to the window, but she could see nothing in the shadows. The moonlight seemed too faint to reveal any movement in the village, but she was sure she wasn't alone. Leona's breath caught in her throat. Her eyes darted around the room, scanning the corners for any movement. The flickering of the firelight seemed to cast strange shapes on the walls, making her wonder if she was imagining things. Perhaps it was just the shadows playing tricks on her mind, the weariness of sleepless nights catching up to her. Yet, deep down, she knew it wasn't just her imagination. There it was again, a faint rustle, almost imperceptible, like the soft shuffle of feet across the floor. Leona's heart hammered in her chest. She held her breath, listening. The sound had come from the farthest corner of the room, where the old wooden chest stood, half hidden by a large woolen rug. "Mother?" Leona whispered, but her voice felt fragile, lost in the vastness of the silence. No answer. Leona slowly reached over and shook Rowan awake. His eyes fluttered open, and for a moment he seemed disoriented. "What is it?" he mumbled, rubbing his eyes. "Do you hear that?" Leona asked, her voice barely a whisper. She tried to keep the tremble out of it, but it was impossible. Rowan's brow furrowed, and he sat up, glancing around the room. "I don't hear anything, Leona. Maybe you're just tired. You've been awake for hours." But Leona knew what she had heard. It wasn't the usual creaks of the house settling. This was something different, something deliberate. She rose. From her mattress, her bare feet touching the cold stone floor. Slowly, she crept toward the chest, her eyes never leaving the corner. The fire had nearly died, leaving the room in near total darkness. Her fingers clenched the edge of the chest, her breath shallow. Suddenly, A low, guttural growl echoed from the corner. Leona froze. It wasn't an animal. It was human, or something close to it. A strange rasping sound that sent a chill crawling up her spine. She jerked her head toward the door, but it was locked. No one had entered. There was no sign of movement from the outside. Her pulse quickened. This wasn't normal. With trembling hands, she reached for the small dagger her father had left her for protection, hidden beneath the blanket. She wasn't skilled in using it, but it was all she had. Slowly, she raised the blade, the cool metal, strangely grounding her in the chaos of her fear. The growling grew louder, closer now. It was right behind the chest. Leona's body tensed, her breath shallow and ragged. Then, suddenly, the growl stopped. For a moment, there was nothing, just the deafening silence that stretched on. Leona stood in the dark, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't see anything, but she felt the presence in the room, as though something, or someone, was watching her. A shiver ran down her spine, and she took a cautious step back toward her bed, her eyes never leaving the shadows. The room was still again, too still. Rowan had gotten to his feet by now, his eyes wide with confusion and fear. "Leona, what's going on? What's happening?" "I don't know," Leona replied, her voice barely audible. She could feel her legs shaking beneath her, the weight of fear pushing her down. "I swear I heard something." A cold breeze swept through the room, causing the dim light from the fire to flicker wildly. Then, in the far corner, just near the chest, a figure appeared in the darkness. Its outline was faint, but it was unmistakable. A tall, hunched form, cloaked in shadows. Leona's breath caught in her throat. The figure moved, slowly at first, then with a swift, unnatural grace. It was as if the shadows themselves were alive, crawling across the floor. She had no time to think, no time to act. Suddenly, the figure vanished into the corner, as though it had melted into the stone wall. Leona stood frozen, her heart in her throat, unable to move. The air was thick with an eerie silence, and the darkness seemed to close in on her. She looked at Rowan, whose face was as pale as hers. "Did you see that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Rowan nodded, his lips barely parting as he spoke. "We need to get out of here." But as Leona reached for the door, she realized something worse than the sickness had entered their home. And it was not a disease that could be warded off with herbs. The next few days passed in a blur of unease. Leona barely slept, her thoughts racing with fear and confusion. The strange figure that had appeared in the corner of their room, vanishing into the stone walls, haunted her. She couldn't stop, wondering what it was. Was it a spectre? A figment of her imagination? Or had something far more sinister taken root in the village? She barely spoke to anyone about what had happened. Rowan had begged her to tell their parents, but Leona couldn't find the words. They'd already been through enough. Constant worry over the sickness, sleepless nights, and the threat of thieves and marauders. The last thing they needed was for her to add talk of strange, shadowy figures. But the feeling remained, a persistent chill crawling beneath her skin, never letting her forget. One evening, after the sun had set, and the last light of day faded, behind the hills, Leona decided to visit the village elder, old Mirena, a woman known for her knowledge of herbs, spells, and things beyond mortal understanding. Many believed Mirena was the only one in the village who might know the true cause of the sleeping sickness and how to end it. Leona had never spoken to her much, but now she felt a strange pull toward the elder's small cottage at the edge of the village where she lived alone. Her reputation was one of mystery and fear, but perhaps that was what Leona needed. Someone who understood the darker, hidden things that others dared not speak of. The path to Mirena's cottage was narrow and overgrown with vines, the air thick with the scent of damp earth. The wind had picked up, carrying with it the whisper of trees and the faintest sound of footsteps, though she couldn't see anyone around. When Leona reached the door, she hesitated for a moment, The elder had never been known for kindness, but she had knowledge that Leona now desperately sought. She knocked. Moments later, the door creaked open, and old Marina stood in the doorway, her wrinkled face unreadable. Her eyes, however, gleamed with something far sharper than any age should permit. The air seemed to crackle with unspoken words. "Leona," Marina said, in a voice that was raspy yet commanding. "I've been expecting you." Leona's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't spoken a word of her troubles to anyone. How? Did Marina know? "Come in," the elder instructed, stepping aside to allow Leona entry. The inside of the cottage was cluttered with bundles of dried plants, jars of unknown substances, and old books scattered across a wooden table. A fire burned low in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the walls. Leona stepped in, looking around in awe at the strange and mysterious surroundings. The air smelled of dried herbs and incense, a mixture that was at once soothing and unsettling. "Sit," Marina motioned to a worn chair by the fire. "Tell me what has been troubling you, child." Leona swallowed hard, unsure where to start. I saw something," she finally managed. "In our cottage. It was a figure, a shadow, moving in the corner of the room. It disappeared into the wall." Marina's gaze didn't falter. "A watcher," she said, her voice low, almost to herself. "I knew it would come for you." Leona's heart skipped a beat. "What is it? What is happening?" The elder leaned forward, her eyes fixed on Leona. "The sickness you speak of, it is not a simple illness, but a curse. A curse that has haunted this land for centuries." Leona stared at her, disbelief rising within her. "A curse? But the herbs, the sickness, I thought it was just a disease." Marina shook her head. "No, child. The sickness is merely a symptom, a consequence of something much older. It begins in the mind, in the dreams. The figure you saw." She paused, her eyes narrowing. "It is the spirit of the sickness. It feeds on the fear, the unrest of those who do not sleep. It is drawn to those who are trapped in the endless cycle of wakefulness." Leona's mind raced. The pieces were beginning to fit together, but she couldn't understand. "So it's not the sickness itself that's causing the deaths? It's something else." "The sickness is the vessel," Marina said softly. "But the true cause is something far darker. This land was once cursed by an ancient spirit, one that thrived on fear and suffering. Over time it grew stronger, feeding on the dreams of the people. Those who could never rest, who were always on edge, were its perfect prey." Leona felt her stomach churn. She had never heard anything like this. "How do we stop it?" she asked, her voice shaky. "You cannot stop it," Marina replied with an air of finality. "Not unless you confront it. Face it directly in the realm of dreams, where it exists. But be warned, child. Few have ever returned from that place, and those who do are forever changed." Leona felt her heart hammer in her chest. She had lived with the fear of the sickness, but now she was faced with something much worse. An ancient spirit that preyed on the minds of the living. "Then, how do we fight it?" Leona asked, her voice barely a whisper. Marina's gaze softened, and for the first time, she seemed almost compassionate. "There is a way," she said quietly. "But it will take everything from you. You must face your own fears, your deepest nightmares, and if you survive, you may have a chance to rid this land of the curse forever. But remember, what you fight may change you in ways you cannot yet understand." Leona felt a cold shiver crawl up her spine. The path before her was no longer just a matter of survival. It was a journey into the very heart of darkness, and there would be no turning back. In the small, fog-laden village of Gildenbrook, nestled between rolling hills and a river that glistened with the promise of life, a peculiar custom had long been adopted. The villagers drank beer. From sunrise to sunset, the people sipped from their mugs, their faces flushed from the constant flow of the low-alcohol drink. Beer, though not much stronger than water, was the safest thing to drink. It had to be. The year was 1376, and the plague of contaminated water had plagued the region for decades. Rivers, wells, and streams had all been tainted with diseases that brought fever, vomiting, and death to those foolish enough to drink from them. The air in Gildenbrook smelled of hops, yeast, and barley, a scent that marked every household, every cobbled street, and every open square. It wasn't just the adults who partook in this odd ritual. Even children, barely old enough to walk, were given small mugs filled with beer, as it was the only thing that could keep their stomachs from becoming bloated with sickness. Edric was one such child. At the age of 15, he had known little else but this way of life. The constant clink of mugs, the never-ending flow of fermented beverages, and the quiet murmur of adults debating the quality of the beer were familiar sounds. But as the years passed, Edric began to notice something that unsettled him. People never seemed quite right. Their faces were too round, their eyes too glazed, their laughter too loud. They lived in a fog, a haze created not just by the alcohol, but by the fact that no one ever questioned it. No one dared. Edric, unlike his peers, had always been curious. He questioned everything, from the words of the village priest to the practices passed down from father to son. Why, he wondered, did they never ask if there was another way? Surely, there had to be a safer alternative than beer, mead, and cider. But who dared defy tradition? His family owned a small farm on the outskirts of the village, a modest plot where they grew barley and hops. His father, Gareth, was the town's primary brewer, a position that brought them both pride and wealth. The tavern, run by Edric's father, was always filled with patrons, their voices rising in merriment and slurring speech. Edric's father saw the brewery as a lifeline, a service to the people, and a business that kept the family thriving. But Edric could never reconcile the comfort of their success with the fact that everyone was always drinking. Always, and always dangerously. "You can't change the way things are, Edric," his father often told him. "It's not just the beer, it's the way of the world. The water's poisoned, the land is cursed. All we can do is survive." But Edric was not so easily convinced. One evening, after his father had fallen asleep beside his mug, Edric slipped out of the house and made his way to the old mill on the edge of the village. The miller, Serene, was a mysterious woman known for her healing herbs. She was an outsider, a woman who didn't quite fit into the mold of village life. She had an air of knowledge about her, an ancient wisdom that intrigued Edric. The full moon illuminated the path as Edric crept toward her small, overgrown cottage. He knocked softly on the door, half expecting her to be asleep. Instead, Serene opened it almost immediately, as though she had been waiting for him. "Edric," she said, her voice calm and knowing. "I've been expecting you." The night air was crisp as Edric stepped inside Serene's cottage, the scent of herbs and earthy spices immediately filling his senses. It was nothing like the tavern where his father brewed his beer. Here, the air was fresh and thick with the smell of nature, of plants, of life itself. Serene closed the door behind him and gestured for him to sit at the small wooden table. She was tall, with striking dark eyes that seemed to look past him, into a world Edric could not yet see. Her hair was wrapped in a simple cloth, but it was her presence that caught his attention. Strong, unyielding, yet kind. "I know why you've come," she said, as she set a steaming cup of herbal tea before him. "You want to know if there's another way?" Edric hesitated, unsure of how to phrase the words that had been swirling in his mind for so long. "People here, they say the beer is safe, but I can't help but wonder if there's something better, something that doesn't make us slow." Serene smiled softly. "You're not the first to question it. Many have come before you, hoping to find a way to drink without falling under the haze of fermented drinks." Edric's heart raced. "You mean there is another way?" She nodded. "There is, but it's not easy. And it comes with great risk. To purify water, to make it safe to drink without the need for alcohol, is a secret that few know, and even fewer are willing to believe. Edric leaned forward, his curiosity growing with every word. What do you mean by purify? Seraphine stood and moved to a small shelf of books and jars filled with dried herbs. She retrieved a thick, ancient-looking book and opened it carefully. In the old days, long before the contamination of water became widespread, there were ways to purify it. Herbs, roots, and the alchemy of nature. Water could be cleansed and safe to drink again. Edric's eyes widened. But why hasn't anyone tried it here? Fear, Seraphine answered simply, her voice dropping to a whisper. Fear of change. Fear of what will happen to a society built on centuries of tradition. If people stop drinking the fermented beverages, what would they do? How would the taverns survive? The brewers, the millers, even the merchants. It's all tied to the alcohol. It's not just a drink. It's the lifeblood of the economy. People's livelihoods depend on it. Edric felt a pang of guilt. His father was a well-respected brewer. The tavern they ran was one of the most profitable in Gildenbrook. If Seraphine's methods could purify water, it could disrupt everything, including his family's future. I didn't come here to destroy my father's work, Edric said, his voice faltering. I just want to know if there's a way to make the water safe, without the constant fog of alcohol, without the sickness. Seraphine paused, her fingers tracing the pages of the book. The first step is to find the herbs that can cleanse the water. There are plants, roots, and even certain minerals that have the power to purify. But those plants are rare, and the people who know how to use them, they are few and far between. Edric's mind raced. Can you teach me? Seraphine looked him in the eye, her gaze steady. I can teach you what I know, but it will take time, patience, and a willingness to go against everything you've been taught. For a moment, Edric hesitated. His father, his village, and the entire region lived on a system that had been in place for generations. How could one young man with a handful of herbs change anything? But deep inside, something stirred, a desire for truth, for something better, the faint hope that there was indeed a way to live without the constant buzz of alcohol clouding the minds of the people. I'm willing to learn, he said finally, determination setting in. I'll do whatever it takes. Seraphine smiled, a rare warmth in her expression. Then let's begin. The days turned into weeks, and Edric's knowledge of herbs and the power they held to purify water deepened. He learned of plants such as willow bark, which could filter impurities from water, and dandelion root, known for its ability to absorb toxins. Seraphine taught him how to brew potions that would remove the bitter taste of water and make it safe for drinking. Slowly, Edric began to see the world through different eyes. The one where the alcohol-soaked haze of Gildenbrook could be replaced with clarity. Yet, as his mind expanded with new possibilities, the pressure on him grew. Whispers spread faster than Edric could gather the herbs, and soon it wasn't just the villagers who were asking questions, but his father as well. Gareth noticed his son's absence from the brewery more and more, the strange books and jars he would return home with, and the odd look in his eyes. Something was changing in Edric, something that Gareth didn't quite understand or care to. One evening, as the orange glow of the setting sun cast long shadows over the tavern, Edric's father sat him down at the bar. You've been spending too much time with that woman, Gareth said, his voice low, almost a growl. The herbalist. What's this nonsense you've been learning? Edric tried to remain calm, but his heart raced. I'm not learning nonsense, father. There's a way to purify the water. It's not safe to drink the beer and cider anymore. People are getting sick. Gareth slammed his hand on the counter, startling Edric. I've been brewing beer for 20 years, and never once has it harmed anyone. People trust me, Edric. I keep them safe. You don't understand what you're talking about. I do understand, Edric shot back, his voice shaking with frustration. You've always told me that the beer is safe, but it isn't. You can't keep pretending that everything's fine just because it's always been this way. Gareth's face hardened. You're a fool if you think you can change the way things are. This village has been built on alcohol, on beer, wine, and cider. Without it, we wouldn't survive. People wouldn't trust water from the river or from wells if it wasn't for the beer we brew. Edric stood up, his fists clenched. I'm not saying we abandon the tavern or the brewery. I'm saying we find another way, a safer way. There's more to life than just the beer, Father. Gareth's eyes narrowed, and his voice lowered to a threatening tone. If you don't get your head out of the clouds, you'll ruin everything we've worked for. You'll ruin this village, and you'll ruin yourself. Edric left the tavern, his mind spinning with the weight of his father's words. He couldn't turn back now. He had seen too much, and he knew what had to be done. But the road ahead was becoming more difficult. The next day, Edric returned to Seraphine's cottage, determined to learn more about how they could make the change happen. But as he approached the mill, he saw something that made his heart drop into his stomach. A group of villagers stood at the entrance to Seraphine's cottage, their faces grim and full of suspicion. Among them was Bran, the village constable, and Evelyn, the tavern keeper's wife. The villagers were whispering angrily, and Edric could hear their voices rise. She's been spreading her witchcraft to the boy. Bran's voice carried over to Edric. And now he's got ideas in his head about abandoning beer. We can't allow that. The village won't stand for it. Edric's stomach churned. He moved quickly, slipping through the bushes to the back of the cottage. He knocked on the door softly, hoping it wasn't too late. Seraphine opened the door, her face drawn with concern. They've found out, she said quietly. I knew it wouldn't take long. Did they say anything about me? Edric asked, anxiety creeping into his voice. They know you've been coming here, she said, motioning for him to come inside. And they know what you've been learning. They're scared, Edric. They're scared of losing their way of life. They believe that if you challenge the tradition, the whole village will fall apart. Edric's heart pounded in his chest. What do we do now? I can't go back. Not after what my father said. He thinks I'm ruining everything. Seraphine took a deep breath and placed a hand on his shoulder. This is the point of no return. You've made the decision to change things, and now you must be prepared for the consequences. There will be opposition. There will be resistance. But if you truly believe in what you're doing, then you can't stop now. Edric looked at her, the weight of the world heavy on his shoulders. But how do I make them listen? How do I show them that there's another way? Seraphine smiled, a hint of mischief in her eyes. We don't make them listen, Edric. We show them. We prove to them that the water can be safe, and that there's no need for alcohol to survive. I have a plan, but it will require your courage, and the courage of those who believe in you. Edric took a deep breath, the uncertainty in his chest beginning to settle. I'm ready. Seraphine led him to a small shelf where a jar of glowing powder rested. This, she said, holding it up, is a key ingredient. It will purify water in a way no one has seen before. But we need to demonstrate it, right in front of them. They'll have no choice but to believe. The village square was busy, as it always was on market days. The scent of freshly baked bread mingled with the earthy aroma of vegetables and the hearty fragrance of grilled meats. But today, something was different. The usual hum of voices was laced with tension. Whispers ran through the crowd like wildfire as people gathered to see what Edric and Seraphine were planning. Edric's heart pounded in his chest as he stood with Seraphine at the center of the square. The glowing jar of purified powder sat. On the table before them, a mysterious substance that would change everything. The villagers had gathered, some with curiosity, others with suspicion in their eyes, and a few with outright disdain. It wasn't hard to spot Bran and Evelyn at the front of the crowd, their faces grim and eyes fixed on Edric. Are you sure about this? Seraphine asked, her voice soft but filled with a quiet intensity. Edric nodded, though his hands were shaking. I don't have a choice. If they're going to believe anything, it has to be now. This is the moment. Seraphine nodded, her eyes scanning the crowd. Then we begin. The villagers fell silent as Edric raised his voice to address them. People of Gildenbrook. His words echoed through the square. I've spent weeks learning something that could save us all. I know you've trusted beer, cider, and mead for generations, but those drinks, they come with risks. You've all seen the sickness, the sluggishness. We live under the weight of it every day, but we don't have to anymore. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some skeptical, some eager to see where this was going. Edric's voice grew stronger. Seraphine and I have discovered a way to purify the water. It's safe, it's clean, and it doesn't require alcohol. To survive, we can drink the water from the river without the fear of sickness. I'm asking you to see the truth. Look, I'll prove it. He gestured to the jar. This is the powder that will purify the water. Watch. Seraphine stepped forward, taking a small vial of river water and pouring it into a basin. The water was murky, filled with impurities and the residue of contaminants. Edric could see the skeptical looks in the villagers' eyes, especially Bran and Evelyn. It was clear they didn't believe a word of it. Seraphine took the jar of powder and, with a steady hand, she poured a small amount into the water. The change was immediate. The water began to clear, the murky brown fading away to reveal a pristine liquid, clear and untouched by disease. The crowd gasped in astonishment. Edric stepped forward, taking the first cup of water and drinking from it. The cool liquid slid down his throat, refreshing and pure. His eyes locked with Seraphine's, and he smiled, something he hadn't done in weeks. This is safe. This is what we can all drink, without fear. But just as the crowd began to murmur in awe, Bran stepped forward, his face a mask of rage. You think this trickery will change anything? His voice was loud and angry, enough to make the crowd flinch. You think that one cup of water will undo years of tradition? You're a fool, Edric, a dangerous fool. Evelyn, standing next to Bran, crossed her arms. This is madness. Do you honestly think people will give up their mead, their cider, their beer? These drinks are part of us. Without them, what would we have? You're threatening everything that keeps this village alive. You're threatening our livelihoods. Edric's eyes flashed with determination. I'm not threatening anyone's livelihood. I'm offering something better, something that will keep us healthy. We don't have to live in this fog of alcohol, pretending that we're fine when we're not. Bran sneered. Then let's see how the rest of the village feels. He turned to the crowd, his voice rising in a rallying cry. Who among you will let this boy and his witch destroy what we've built? Who among you will allow this heresy to take root? The villagers began to murmur again, their faces divided. Some looked uneasy, others eager, but many were still, too loyal to their old ways. The tension in the air was thick, and Edric could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had to convince them, but he couldn't do it alone. Seraphine stepped forward, her calm voice cutting through the noise. This isn't just about water, Bran. This is about the future. You can't ignore the truth forever. Alcohol is not the answer. We've seen the sickness, the slow decline of the village. You can't deny that something needs to change. Bran's eyes burned with anger, but Seraphine didn't flinch. We have to make a choice. We can either continue down this path, where our people grow weaker every year, or we can embrace a new future, one where we can be stronger, healthier, and free from the constant fog of fermented drinks. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, an unexpected voice rose from the crowd. I've lost my husband to the sickness, said Martha, an older woman from the village. He drank the beer every day, and it ruined him. I didn't believe what you said, Edric. I thought it was just nonsense. But now I see the truth. If this water can heal us, then I'm willing to try. A ripple of agreement spread through the crowd, one voice at a time. Slowly, people began to step forward, each sharing their own story of sickness, of loss, and of a life spent trapped in a cycle they no longer wanted. Bran's face turned red with fury, but he could see that the tide was shifting. The villagers were starting to listen, to believe. "You've made a mistake," Bran spat, but his words lacked conviction now. "You'll regret this." "I don't think we will," Edric said firmly, his voice rising once more. "We have a choice now. We can choose health. We can choose life. We can choose a future without the chains of alcohol." With that, Edric and Seraphine turned away from the crowd, leaving behind the whispers of rebellion and the hope of a new beginning. In the village of Thornbrook, nestled between the towering hills and the winding river, life followed a simple, though difficult, rhythm. The sun rose early, casting its harsh light over the thatched roof cottages and narrow cobblestone streets. The people of Thornbrook lived in a world where superstition was as thick as the morning fog, where ancient beliefs about health and hygiene shaped the daily lives of everyone. Their community had learned to embrace the grimminess of their surroundings, for in their eyes, the dirt they carried was a form of protection. The fear of water, especially when it came to bathing, ran deep in their veins. For centuries, the villagers had held the belief that cleanliness was not just unnecessary, but dangerous. They feared the open pores that water might create, believing they would invite sickness and disease into the body. To them, the idea of submerging in water and washing away all impurities was a luxury they could not afford, nor would they ever dare. Instead, they relied on traditional methods of cleaning that, while seemingly less effective, were considered far safer. Eveline, a young woman of 20, had always been curious about the world beyond the village. Her mother, Maoris, a stern woman with weathered skin and a relentless spirit, had taught her from an early age that cleanliness was something to be feared. "Pores are your enemies, Eveline," Maoris would say, her sharp eyes never leaving the task at hand. "Too much water will open them, and the diseases will flood in." Eveline could never forget the way her mother's hands trembled as she prepared herbal concoctions meant to keep her skin clear of blemishes. Ointments, poultices, oils, all designed to close her pores, to seal the body from any external threats. The villagers of Thornbrook had been taught from birth to wash only when absolutely necessary, and even then, it was a quick splash from the well or river, enough to cleanse the surface without opening the pores. But for Eveline, this belief had always felt limiting. She wondered what it might feel like to immerse herself in the clear, cool waters of the river, or the steam-filled air of the village bathhouse. Her thoughts often turned to the bathhouse of Thornbrook, a large building near the riverbank where the locals gathered once every fortnight. The bathhouse was a place of paradoxes. On the one hand, it promised relief, a chance to wash away the grime of the day. But on the other hand, it had become a symbol of everything the villagers feared. People spoke of the bathhouse as though it were a place of contagion, an open door to sickness. The water in the bathhouse was always tepid, stagnant, and murky, stained by the bodies that had soaked in it before. The air was thick with the scent of sweat and mildew, and the sounds of gossip filled the room like a steady hum. More than once, Eveline had heard women gossiping about the illnesses that spread through the bathhouse: lice, fleas, and the terrible bedbugs that seemed to infest every corner of the place. It was not uncommon for people to leave the bathhouse with their skin crawling, not from the water, but from the creatures that thrived in the damp, crowded space. There were also the rumours of Lord Oren, the village's most respected, yet feared figure, who had met his untimely demise after visiting the bathhouse. Some said it was the bad water that killed him. Others whispered it was the disease that spread so rapidly through the village after his visit. But whatever the cause, the story of Lord Oren's death became something of a legend. The village did not speak of it openly, but the murmurs were always there, like a shadow lurking behind every conversation. Yet despite all the warnings and superstitions, Eveline felt an odd draw to the bathhouse. She had never been inside, but her curiosity gnawed at her, a feeling that was impossible to ignore. She wondered what it would be like to truly cleanse herself, to soak in the warm, inviting water, to surrender to the steam and forget the fears that had governed her life. On one particularly warm afternoon, Eveline's curiosity became unbearable. She stood at the edge of the river, staring at the sparkling waters. She was alone. Her mother had gone to visit a neighbouring village, and Eveline saw this as the perfect opportunity. The fear that had kept her away from the bathhouse for so long now gripped her even tighter. Would the water really cause her to fall ill? Would she open herself to the very diseases she had been taught to avoid? But her desire to understand her own body, her own limits, was stronger than the stories that had been passed down for generations. She took a deep breath and walked into the river. The cold water rushed over her feet, sending shivers up her spine. As she stepped deeper, the water rose to her knees, then her waist, and soon she was completely submerged. Eveline closed her eyes, letting the coolness embrace her, feeling the tension in her body melt away. For the first time in her life, she felt free. The water did not open her pores and flood her body with sickness. Instead, it felt like a cleansing, an awakening. But as Eveline rose from the river, dripping wet, her thoughts turned dark. What if the village was right? What if this water, this seemingly innocent act of cleansing, would bring about a terrible fate? As she returned to the shore, her heart raced with uncertainty. She had broken one of the village's oldest taboos, and now the consequences would follow. The sun had long since dipped behind the hills, and the sky was painted in shades of purple and gold when Eveline returned home from the river. Her clothes clung to her skin, heavy with the weight of the water, but she didn't feel cold. In fact, she felt strangely warm, almost as though the water had cleansed not only her body, but also some deeper part of her soul. She had been taught to fear the water, to fear the very act of cleansing herself, but now she understood the pleasure of it. However, the moment Eveline stepped back into her cottage, she was struck by an overwhelming sense of guilt. Her mother would be home soon. Eveline knew she had crossed a line, and the thought of facing Maris was almost too much to bear. She quickly stripped off her wet clothes, folding them neatly as though nothing had happened, and tucked herself under a blanket, trying to forget the feeling of the river's water. But sleep didn't come. Instead, she lay in bed, wide awake, her thoughts racing. The water, the bathhouse, the gossip, everything seemed to swirl in her mind like a storm. What if the village was right? What if she had opened herself up to disease, to illness, to something worse? Would she wake up tomorrow with a fever? Or worse yet, the lice and fleas that so often plagued those who ventured into the bathhouse? The next day, Eveline felt the weight of her actions pressing on her chest. Her body didn't ache, and she didn't feel any ill effects from the water, but the fear that something would go wrong lingered in her mind like a shadow. When Maris returned, she didn't mention the river or her bath, but Eveline could see the subtle way her mother's gaze lingered on her, searching for something, perhaps a sign of sickness. Eveline forced a smile, pretending everything was fine, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Maris knew something had changed. Later, that afternoon, Eveline went to the village square to purchase herbs from the local apothecary. As she passed the other women of the village, she overheard fragments of their conversations. They were speaking in hushed tones about something that had happened in the bathhouse. Eveline's heart skipped a beat as she heard one of the women mention the name of her mother, Maris. "Did you hear? Maris's daughter was seen in the river yesterday," one of the women whispered. "They say she went in after dark, by herself. And we all know what happens to those who stray too far from the path." Eveline's pulse quickened, and she turned away, hoping no one had noticed her eavesdropping. The whispers were already beginning, the rumours taking shape in the minds of the villagers. The fear of water, of cleanliness, had woven itself into their lives so tightly that even the smallest deviation from their norms was viewed with suspicion. By the time Eveline returned home, her mother had already heard the gossip. Maris stood by the hearth, stirring a pot of stew, her face tense with worry. "I heard what they're saying about you, Eveline," she said, her voice calm but heavy with a weight Eveline could not bear. "You've gone and broken the one rule that has kept us safe all these years." Eveline's stomach twisted. "It was just the river, Mother," she protested. "I didn't mean any harm. I wanted to understand, to know if the water was truly as dangerous as they say." Maris turned to face her daughter, her eyes narrowing. "You don't understand, Eveline. It's not just about the water. It's about the way we've survived all these years, the way we've protected ourselves. If you want to live like them, if you want to risk it all for the sake of your curiosity, then you might as well be ready for the consequences." Eveline's heart sank. What consequences? Her mother didn't answer immediately, but the silence that followed was more damning than any words. The following days were filled with whispers, not just from the women of the village, but from the men as well. Eveline could feel the judgment in their eyes as they passed her in the street. The small, close-knit community that had once accepted her with warmth now seemed to recoil at the slightest hint of something unfamiliar. It was as if she had become a symbol of something dangerous, something that threatened the carefully constructed world they had lived in for centuries. Despite the coldness that now surrounded her, Eveline couldn't shake her need to understand the truth. The river had not harmed her. The water had not opened her pores to sickness. If anything, she felt more alive, more connected to the world around her. One evening, unable to ignore the gnawing curiosity any longer, Eveline made a decision. She would go to the bathhouse. If she could see for herself what the others feared, if she could experience the place that had been the source of so many rumors and secrets, then she would know whether or not the superstitions were true. Under the cover of night, Eveline slipped out of her cottage, her heart pounding with anticipation and fear. The moon hung low in the sky as she made her way toward the riverbank. The path was quiet, save for the rustling of leaves in the breeze. She could hear the faint sound of voices ahead. Laughter, gossip, the murmurs of the bathhouse patrons. When she arrived, the doors of the bathhouse stood wide open, and she hesitated. Should she really do this? Was she prepared to face whatever horrors lay beyond the threshold? But her curiosity, the same force that had led her to the river, pushed her forward. Eveline stepped inside, and the thick, humid air of the bathhouse enveloped her like a heavy cloak. The dim light of the lanterns flickered across the room, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The sounds of splashing water and whispered conversations filled the space, and then she saw them. Men and women, gathered together in the same murky waters that had been the source of so much fear. But as Eveline stepped closer to the water, a new realization washed over her. It wasn't the water that was dangerous. It was the fear itself, the fear that had controlled their lives for so long. The bathhouse was unlike anything Eveline had imagined. The air was thick with steam, and the flickering light from oil lamps cast strange, haunting shadows along the stone walls. It was a space of paradoxes: warmth and cold, comfort and discomfort, clarity and confusion. People moved about, their voices rising and falling in a low hum, like a gathering storm. It felt like a dream, or perhaps a nightmare, but Eveline couldn't look away. The water, though murky and unclean by the villagers' standards, didn't seem as threatening as the rumors had made it out to be. There were no signs of sickness, no grotesque figures lurking in the depths. The people who bathed here looked as normal as anyone, their skin flushed from the heat, but their eyes devoid of the fear that had taken root in Eveline's heart for so long. She had expected to find illness, lice crawling across the skin, or some unspoken contagion festering in the waters, but there was nothing. Yet the tension in the air was palpable, an undercurrent of unease that ran deeper than the fear of disease. The room was filled with unspoken rules, hidden dangers, and the weight of a centuries-old tradition that governed the actions of everyone present. Eveline could feel it pressing against her, suffocating her in its silence. As she stepped deeper into the bathhouse, her eyes scanned the room. Most of the villagers were in their own corners, speaking in hushed tones, their voices low and cautious. The same whispers Eveline had heard in the streets now seemed to echo off the walls. The conversation stopped abruptly when Eveline entered. All eyes turned toward her, the weight of judgment settling on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. The silence felt louder than any word could. Eveline stood at the edge of the water, her heart racing in her chest. She could feel the burning gazes of the villagers, some out of curiosity, others out of disdain. She had broken the unspoken rule. She had come to the bathhouse, the place where people gathered but were never truly accepted. And now she was, the outsider, the one who dared to challenge the long-held beliefs of her people. The village elder, Galen, who had been sitting near the water, stood up and walked toward her. His face was carved with age, his deep-set eyes sharp with wisdom and sorrow. He was a man of few words, but when he spoke, it was with the weight of history behind him. "You've come to test the waters, haven't you?" Galen's voice was calm, but it held an edge. "We all have our reasons for coming here, but you, Eveline, seem to be searching for something more, something we left behind long ago." Eveline nodded, her throat dry. "I need to know, Galen. All my life, I've been taught to fear this place, to fear the water. But when I went to the river, it didn't harm me. And now, standing here, I don't know what to believe anymore. Why have we been taught this?" Galen studied her for a long moment, his eyes scanning her face as though searching for something hidden deep inside. Then he sighed and motioned for her to follow him. "I'll show you, Eveline. But understand this, what I reveal may change everything. Once you know the truth, there's no going back." Eveline hesitated but followed him, her heart pounding in her chest. They walked toward a smaller private room at the back of the bathhouse, away from the others. The air grew thicker here, the steam swirling like ghosts in the darkness. Inside the room, there was a large stone basin filled with clear water, unlike anything Eveline had seen before. It was pristine, untouched by the dirt and grime that filled the communal bathhouse. Galen stood by the basin and gestured for Eveline to approach. "This," he began, his voice low and heavy, "is what we once had. This is what the village lost." Eveline stepped closer, her curiosity piqued. She could see the clarity of the water now. Its purity was almost mesmerizing. What happened to it? Why did the water change? Galen's eyes hardened as he looked at her. "Long ago, before my time, this water was sacred. It came from deep within the earth, untouched by the outside world. People came here to bathe not only for cleanliness, but for spiritual renewal. But over time, as the fear of disease grew, so did the superstition. The elders feared the loss of control over the people. They twisted the stories to keep the villagers in line, to make them believe that water, clean water, was their enemy." Eveline listened intently, her mind reeling with the enormity of what Galen was revealing. "So the fear was always a lie?" Galen nodded slowly. "Not entirely. There was sickness, yes. There were diseases, as there always are. But they were not caused by the water. They were caused by the fear itself. The belief that the water would harm them poisoned the people more than anything else. It caused them to become weak, to fall into sickness, not because of the water, but because they were afraid of it." Eveline's mind raced. The whole village had been manipulated for generations, trapped in a cycle of fear and superstition. The water, which had once been a symbol of life and renewal, had been turned into a source of horror, and the villagers had bought into the lie. "But why?" Eveline asked, her voice trembling. "Why keep them in the dark?" Galen's face grew grim. "Because fear is a powerful thing. It binds people together, keeps them under control. When people are afraid, they'll follow the rules, the traditions, without question. And in doing so, they give up their power, their autonomy. The elders knew this. They used it to control the village. But now..." He looked at Eveline, his eyes heavy with sorrow. "Now, it is up to you. The truth is in your hands. Eveline stood there, her heart pounding, her thoughts whirling. The truth had been staring her in the face all along, but she had been too blinded by fear to see it. The water wasn't the enemy. The enemy was the lie. And now that she knew the truth, she had to decide what to do with it. The weight of the truth that Eveline had uncovered settled heavily on her shoulders. The water, the bathhouse, and the village's fears were all based on lies, manipulated for generations by those who sought to control. The fear that had ruled the hearts of the people was nothing but an illusion, a tool used to maintain power. And now, Eveline had to decide how to bring this truth to the light. As she stood in the private room with Galen, the weight of her decision grew heavier. She had seen the truth, and she could no longer pretend that the fear of the bathhouse, the water, and the supposed dangers were real. But the question remained. How could she convince the villagers, who had lived their entire lives believing in these superstitions, to break free from them? Would they listen to her, or would they dismiss her as a fool? "You understand now, Eveline," Galen said, his voice steady but filled with an undercurrent of sadness. "The village will never change unless someone shows them the truth. It's not enough to know what's real. You have to make them see it for themselves." Eveline nodded, her heart beating faster as she thought about the difficult task ahead. The village had lived in fear for so long that the truth might be too much for them to accept. But she knew she couldn't walk away. She had uncovered the truth, and now it was her responsibility to share it, no matter the consequences. The next morning, Eveline stood at the center of the village square. The sounds of the market buzzed around her, and the usual chatter of the villagers filled the air. She could feel the weight of their eyes on her, their gaze heavy with suspicion and judgment. They had all heard the rumors about her visit to the bathhouse, and they had already formed their opinions. But today, Eveline was determined to change that. She climbed onto a wooden crate, her hands trembling slightly as she prepared to speak. The villagers fell silent, their eyes narrowing as they watched her. The tension in the air was thick, but Eveline pushed through it. She could not let fear control her any longer. "I've learned something," Eveline began, her voice loud and clear. "Something that will change everything. For years, we've lived in fear of the water. We've been taught that it is dangerous, that it will bring disease and sickness. But I've seen the truth. The water does not harm us. The fear that we've lived with for generations is a lie." A murmur spread through the crowd. The whispers began, the same ones that had followed her every step since she had first defied the village's rules. Some looked at her with disbelief, others with outright hostility, but Eveline pressed on. "The fear we've been taught to carry is what keeps us weak. It keeps us from seeing the world for what it really is. I've bathed in the water. I've been to the bathhouse, and I can tell you now, it is not the water that threatens us. It is the fear itself." A man in the crowd, one of the village elders, shouted from the back, "You're a fool, Eveline. You dare challenge the wisdom of our ancestors." Eveline's heart raced, but she did not flinch. "I don't challenge the wisdom of our ancestors. I challenge the lies that have been passed down to us, the ones that keep us chained to fear and superstition. It's time for us to be free, to live without fear of what isn't real." The crowd was silent now, and Eveline could feel the tension building. She knew that the villagers had spent their whole lives living in fear, and this truth might be too much for them to handle. But she had already made up her mind. The truth had to be known. "Will you continue to live in fear?" Eveline asked, her voice shaking with the weight of her own conviction. "Or will you choose to see the world for what it truly is? Will you choose to live, to be free, or will you remain prisoners of a lie?" The silence in the square was deafening. The villagers looked at each other, uncertain, their minds struggling to process the words Eveline had spoken. Some were afraid, their eyes wide with the realization that everything they had believed in was wrong. Others were angry, furious at the audacity of the young woman who dared to question the very foundation of their lives. But then, something unexpected happened. One by one, people began to move. They stepped forward, some with hesitation, others with conviction. The first to approach was Galen, the elder who had shown Eveline the truth. His eyes were filled with a quiet sadness, but there was also a spark of hope in them. "You've done it, Eveline," he said quietly. "You've freed us. Now, we can begin again." And with that, the villagers began to follow. Slowly at first, but with increasing confidence, they moved toward the river. They had been told all their lives that it was dangerous. They had been taught to fear it, but now they had seen the truth. The water was not their enemy. The fear was. Eveline led the way, her heart swelling with a mix of hope and fear. She had broken the chains that had bound the village for generations, but the journey was far from over. The truth had been revealed, but it was up to them to accept it, to embrace it, and to rebuild their lives without the weight of fear hanging over them. As Eveline stood by the river, watching the villagers bathe in its waters for the first time without fear, she knew that their world would never be the same. The lie had been shattered, and with it, the village had been given a new beginning. But the cost had been high. Eveline had lost the comfort of ignorance. She had lost the sense of safety that comes from believing in the old ways. But in its place, she had gained something far greater, a sense of freedom. A freedom that came from knowing the truth. The village of Thornbrook would never be the same. But as the sun set behind the hills, Eveline knew that they had taken the first step toward a new world. One where fear no longer held sway. Eveline's journey freed the village from the grip of fear and superstition, revealing that true strength lies in embracing knowledge and facing the unknown. As the villagers bathed in the river's waters, no longer bound by ancient myths, they stepped into a new era, one of freedom, understanding, and renewal. The truth had set them all free.